So Anusha has been at St. Paul's for quite a while now. How long, Anusha? 9 years, wow. And she is part of our evening service congregation and often speaks and leads as part of that service, which is amazing. And Anusha has so many interesting stories. I always love hearing her stories. And she works in the fashion industry, in case you hadn't noticed. She works in the fashion industry, in case you hadn't noticed. And she currently works for Vogue Business. And I would really recommend looking at this wonderful film that she's just made for Vogue Business about TV and film and costumes, which is really, really cool. And Anusha's going to be sharing her story this morning. She has got so many interesting areas of expertise. One, which she's really passionate about, is sustainable fashion, which is a real passion for Anusha. And I know that if you want to talk more to her about that at any point, do ask her, because she has so many good tips. She's very modest, so she wouldn't tell you this. But a few years ago, she was on the list of 30 under 30 to watch in the fashion industry, which is really, really cool. So she is one to watch for many reasons. So thank you, Anusha, for coming to speak. Can I just pray for you before you speak?
Yes, thank you.
So dear Lord, thank you for Anusha. Thank you for her story. And I just pray this morning as she shares about her family, about her own story, I pray that would speak to each of us with each of our stories, each different, each special. And I thank you for this opportunity to hear something really deeply personal and really special. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Coral. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I hope you've had a great breakfast. Thank you so much to the team for putting on that amazing spread. It's been so delicious. This is actually my first time at Awaken, even though I've been coming here for 9 years. I'm not a morning person, so it took me actually being invited to speak to come, and I will come again. It's such a lovely event. The story that I'm going to be sharing today, it's one that has taken me a very long time to be able to share publicly. I have spoken a little bit about it in the evening service before, and it's something that is quite, I guess, personal, not just to me, but to my family. So I actually had to make sure that my family were okay with me sharing this story as well. And the reason that I've started talking about it is because I was having a conversation a couple of months ago with a very close friend of mine who has known me for years and years, and she's one of my closest Christian friends and knows all of my darkest secrets. She's got a lot of blackmail material on me. But we realized that she actually knew very little about my early childhood, and having that conversation made her realize kind of why I did certain things, or why I kind of operate the way I do in some cases. And it just made me realize that I hadn't spoken about these experiences before. And it kind of made me aware of how important it is to talk about some of these things as well, because it's this particular story of mine and my family's is something that I think if you've been through this experience, it can be very difficult to talk about sometimes and can come with a lot of loaded emotions, and you don't always know that there are other people out there who have been through something similar, and that's why I think it's important to talk about it, especially being on the other side and being able to kind of share how God's grace has carried us through this. So I want to start by asking people here, how many beds do you think you might have slept in over your lifetime? Okay, if you're just counting the homes that you've lived in, who here thinks that they would count more than 5 beds? Well, I was going to come on to that. So if we start with where you've lived, if you've lived or slept in more than 5 beds, maybe more than 10? If we are counting holiday homes, does anyone think they can tally up? I think I travel a lot for work and for pleasure. I think I lost count at about 150, so I know I've slept in a lot of different beds. And I've had to move house quite a lot as well. I don't know about you, but I don't really sleep very easily in new places. My older sister, Tara, is an enviably deep sleeper. There's actually a childhood story of where she went upstairs and went to get a book or something, and she fell asleep with the door closed, and people started to get worried about her, and were banging on the door, and eventually my uncle, I think, kicked down the door and she was still fast asleep. I, on the other hand, my mum told me that she couldn't flush the toilet when I was a baby because that would wake me up, so everyone was tiptoeing around us, and I'm still a very light sleeper. I think people tend to sleep better when they feel like they've got a safe home environment and they're in their own bed and in that place of comfort. When I bought my flat 4 years ago, one of the first things that I did was invest in a really good mattress, because I had spent the last 20-odd years living in different rental properties and never really having my own bed, and I think I spent 10 years before I went into my current flat in the same kind of really flimsy IKEA, like, kind of the cheapest bed frame, and I don't know who had that mattress before, so I don't even know if it was new when we went there. Anyway, it was not a great living situation. So now I have this like custom-made princess bed that my brother-in-law helped me build, and it's kind of like up here, and it's got wardrobe space below, and it's great, and it's really lovely coming home and having a great night's sleep in my own bed. That's actually the first bed that I could truly call my own. So I'm a second-generation British Asian, which means that while I was born here, the rest of my family weren't, my parents weren't. And like many immigrant families, we experienced the difficulty of living in fairly cramped conditions during my childhood in a multi-generational and multi-family household. So not only did my family not have a stable home when I was growing up, I actually didn't have my own bed until I was 9. So for the first 8 years of my life, I was sharing with my parents. My parents came to this country in the late 80s. They had spent 17 years as teachers in Zambia, and they came over for my dad to do his master's in linguistics at Birmingham University at the grand age of 50, which I think is, quite ambitious at that age. He really wanted to do that. He hadn't had the opportunity to go to university before, and he really wanted to take that chance to get his qualifications. And he did really well in that course, and he'd just been accepted to do a PhD when my mother discovered that she was pregnant with me. Now, for a little bit of context, this came 10 years after my sister was born. They'd had 6 years of fertility treatment to have my sister, and several doctors had confirmed that they couldn't have any further children. So you could say it was a bit of a surprise. And it was also a really high-risk pregnancy for my mum, because she was having me at 45 and had earned that assignation of a geriatric pregnancy. So this put a bit of a spanner in the works for my family. They had always planned on moving back to my dad's home country of Mauritius after he completed his PhD. But because of the situation, he actually declined his place to do his doctorate, and my parents decided to stay in the UK for the foreseeable future. So it wasn't a planned move, it was kind of something that just happened. As is often the case with immigrant families, they started by seeking help from other relatives who had already settled here. So they first stayed with some of my cousins, and then we moved in with some of my mother's relatives. And the situation became complicated quite quickly. So my family had come here on my dad's student visa. So what that meant was he wasn't supposed to be working while he was here. He was only allowed to work limited hours. My mum wasn't allowed to work at all. We hadn't come here with the intention of staying, so being able to build a case for applying for residency, we didn't have kind of all of that kind of background paperwork. And also, it didn't help that all 4 members of my family had been born in a different country. So my dad had a Mauritian passport, my mum had a Sri Lankan passport, my sister had a Zambian passport, and I was born in the UK, but I was under my dad's Mauritian passport. So it was a really complex situation that just seemed to go on, and that started to cause a bit of tension in the household where we were staying with our relatives. So when I was 8, things finally came to a head in the home that we were sharing, and we wound up having to leave that place in quite a hurry. And that meant that we were effectively made homeless, and we were placed in a bed and breakfast for several months. And at this point, I upgraded from sharing a bed with my parents to sharing a sofa bed with my sister. And for me, as a child, this new situation was initially, it felt like a bit of an adventure, but the novelty really quickly wore off when I realized that I'd had to leave all of my toys and the bike that my dad had taught me to ride on behind. And to this day, those are still the things that stay with me as memories of a child. Like, you fixate on those things that you think are your worldly possessions at the time. But what had started off as a bit of an adventure started to become quite an uncomfortable experience. And I can't really imagine what it must have been like for my sister at the age of 19, sharing a sofa bed with her baby sister with no end in sight. Now, I recently read what I considered to be quite an obtuse tweet by a political activist who suggested that it's not very difficult to eat healthily on a tight budget because people can just eat budget pasta. And it really ignored the need for literally anything else like sauce or oil or saucepans or a kitchen. And in my family, we've never had a ready meal or a fast food habit. We've always been the kind of family that cooks fresh home-cooked meals. And the only time in my life I can remember when that wasn't the case was when we were living in the bed and breakfast, because we didn't have a kitchen, we didn't have equipment, we didn't have anywhere to store or refrigerate food. And that was a period when our nutrition definitely suffered because we didn't have those cooking facilities, we didn't have a big food budget, and we got breakfast served to us because it was a bed and breakfast, but we were using that breakfast food to supplement 3 meals a day. So I can actually remember times when my mum would take bacon and eggs or sausages from the morning and use it as part of our meal in the evening, or use it to make sandwiches for me to go to school. And during that time, my parents, I think they really fought to maintain a sense of normality for me, making those sandwiches for my school lunches at a time when I probably would have qualified for free meals. But I think the trouble when you're going through that kind of experience is it can also be really difficult to ask for help. And my parents were quite proud people, and they didn't want to ask for help, or maybe they didn't know where to start to get that sort of help either. And so it was possibly more difficult than it even had to be for us, because we weren't getting the help that I think we were probably entitled to at the time. And I think experiencing hardship, whether that's financial difficulty or mental health problems or relationship breakdowns, can often give people a sense of shame. And sometimes we wind up staying in those situations longer than we need to because we're too ashamed to ask for help and talk about our troubles, which is why I feel it's so important to be able to share what we've been through today, if it's going to encourage anyone to be able to actually open up and reach out and ask for help in our church family too. I read a recent study by the Money and Pension Service that showed that 29 million adults in the UK don't feel comfortable talking about money, despite feeling worried about it. And in the wake of the pandemic, 48% of adults worry regularly about money. And this is particularly true in Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. And those in the UK who identify as BAME are also more likely to be worried about their current money situation, with nearly half, so 45%, compared to the national average of 35%, saying that they're worried about it. And young adults, aged 18 to 24, are particularly susceptible to this. So 71% of young adults worry regularly about money, and over a third feel uncomfortable sharing their problems with loved ones and cite shame as one of the biggest reasons for not talking about it. Now, I see real evidence of this among my own friends right now. We've obviously been through a really difficult economic time, and we're going through quite a difficult political time as well. And I've got friends who are either self-employed or work in certain sectors that have been really hard hit by the pandemic, like the creative sector or leisure and hospitality. And many of them have been made redundant, or they've suffered relationship breakdowns, or they're struggling to pay their rent, or they've had to move back with their parents. And that constant running thread of conversation is feeling like they failed and they're too ashamed to talk about their situation. And in my line of work, which is luxury fashion, where we're not exactly saving lives, but we are looking at the impact on the economy. Half of my current research is currently focused on assessing the impact of rising prices and economic uncertainty. And even ordinary groceries in some places have risen by at least an average of 10%, and we've got rising energy prices as well. And so that, coupled with the political tension and the shadow of COVID-19, can make people feel really hopeless. And if you're starting from the beginning again and you're starting from scratch, the journey to stability can seem really impossible. So going back to that situation that we found ourselves in when we were living in a bed and breakfast, I spent a long time being really angry about the instability that I experienced in my childhood, and sometimes I still get angry about it because the effects of that experience still have an impact today. From the age of 9 to the age of 17, we moved house 5 times, and each time it was a different rental. And I hated never having a place to call home and never really having my own bed, and the disruption of having to move frequently. I just wanted to be a normal kid who had their own space in their family home, and that was my perception of the ideal. It was what I saw as the norm among my friends living in Ealing, and I went to school in Ealing, so that was what I was witnessing around me and what I expected from my own life, and there was a real sense of frustration about the iniquity. These days we hear a lot about digital nomads and remote workers and people that can do their work from anywhere in the world whilst traveling around and discovering new places, and that's often viewed as a really enviable and fashionable pursuit. One of the things that I realized when reading the Bible was that actually Jesus was probably one of the first remote workers. So he was a pioneer of the professional nomad lifestyle because he took his ministry up and down the Jordan and from Nazareth to Jerusalem and all around the Sea of Galilee. And he spent his time traveling and teaching. So you could say that nomad life was in his blood. Even before he was born, his parents went on a bit of an ill-timed adventure with his heavily pregnant mum, traveling all the way from Nazareth to Bethlehem, which is about 150 kilometers, so kind of 2-day journey by foot. And then as a toddler, he smuggled away to Egypt to avoid Herod's massacre. Yet surprisingly, Jesus doesn't grow up to be concerned about putting down roots. He doesn't have a fixed residence. He's not worried about making a nice home for himself. In Mark 8, verse 20, Jesus said to one of his prospective followers, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to rest his head." Jesus doesn't find a nice warm bed to rest his head. It's often under a tree or in a boat, and it's just not a concern that he has. He has other priorities, but ultimately I think he also knows that his Father is going to provide for him. When I was about 17, I had a revelation, and it came when I was reading the Bible again, looking at John 14, where it says in verse 14, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that you may be where I am also." And I had a sudden realization, just like in the first song that we were singing today, that I did have a place to call home, a permanent place that was a room in my Father's house, and that would be eternal, where all my needs would be met, because this life is temporary, and I have a Father who is capable of providing for all of my needs. And that realization brought such relief to know that no matter what happened here on earth, Jesus was preparing a special place for me. But I don't think that is just a divine promise. As someone who has the privilege of having a relationship with Christ and of knowing my place as a member of his family and trusting him, I know that God will take care of me in this life too. In Mark 10, verse 29, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me in the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age, homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and fields, along with persecutions, in the age to come and in this age and in eternal life." So I think in this passage, Jesus reminds us that life with him is not free from conflict or difficulties, but our needs will be met. And I believe that this is a promise, not just a promise that Jesus makes to us, but one that we're called to participate in as well. For my family, the first steps towards stability and getting permanent leave to remain in the UK was an application that was actually sponsored by a very kind member of the church that I grew up in. Another member of the church gave my dad a job as a nighttime security guard. And although he was a qualified university lecturer, his student visa still limited the hours that he could work, so they paid cash in hand, and that actually enabled us to move out of the bed and breakfast and into our first private rental. So we had people who were praying for us, but they were also helping us in very practical ways, because that's the way that a church family is supposed to function. And it was while living in that first private rental that we finally received word from the Home Office that we had been granted indefinite leave to remain. So having been born in Surrey, at the age of 10, I was finally given permission to stay. And my family, meanwhile, had renewed their annual visa 13 times until residency was approved. So you can imagine that paper chain that had taken place and the number of years that it took. And a lot of things started happening in that year. I got baptized at the age of 10. It was kind of a period that really revealed to me God's provision, and that's when I chose to give my life to Christ. My sister got engaged, so in that home we actually had her wedding while we were living there. And ironically, one of the first things that we did once we got permanent leave to remain was leave the country, because we were allowed to do that for an extended period now. So we went on a trip to Mauritius, my dad's home country, and it was my first time on a plane and my first time meeting my Mauritian relatives. And over 50 of our relatives came to the airport to greet us. And it was a really emotional reunion. My dad hadn't seen his family in over 15 years because of that long period of kind of waiting and processing and not being able to really have that freedom of movement at the risk of not being rejected at the border again. And while I acquired dual citizenship at the age of 17, my dad actually never applied for British citizenship. He remained a true Mauritian until the end of his days. And although getting residency was a really big step forward, it wasn't the end of our troubles. So my parents found it really difficult to get a mortgage because of their age, and so they were never able to buy a home here. And we continued to move from rental to rental, and they struggled to keep up with the rising costs of living. We lost my dad in 2012 while I was in my final year of university, and then the following year, I started working as a fashion strategist. But it actually took a further 6 years for me to be able to finally save enough for a deposit for a small flat in Harrow, where my mum and I now live together. And I often joke that I did everything right. I got good grades, and I went to a good university, and I built a good career, and I bought my own flat, and I still wound up living with my mother. But one of the first things that we did when we moved into our flat was invite our church friends over to pray for our abode and ask God to bless the new home, while giving thanks that we finally had a place to call home. And it's been such a blessed place. I mean, we aren't always the perfect flatmates. We entered our current situation when I was in my late 20s and my mum was in her mid-70s. And we have vastly different lifestyles and needs from our living situation. We're actually now looking for a really nice retirement flat for my mum and a place for me to move on to. But I no longer experience that sense of dread that I used to get when we moved. And moreover, my starter home has been a source of joy and security and comfort. It's a shoebox, but it's our shoebox. And our tiny patch of garden has hosted parties for up to 12. We've had everything from Eurovision parties to painting parties, and it's just been a place of celebration and of joy. And our sofa bed has given many friends rest for a night. And that is something that we always wanted from our own home, that we would always be able to have it open to others, that we'd be able to host, that we'd be able to do that spontaneously. And I'm working my way up to having a spare room to be able to provide a guest with greater comfort. But it's just so precious to be able to have something that we can share. And I'm always mindful that, like Jesus said, whatever you do for others, whether that's offering them shelter or clothing or provision, you're doing it for God. And we're always conscious of just giving it back to God, because what we have is not our own. It's a resource that he has provided for us. I really believe that God blesses us so that we can bless others, that he puts people in our way so that we can help and support them. And I know that blessing others doesn't always look like tithing or giving to charity. Sometimes it really just means asking the person next to you if they're okay. And recognizing that even in affluent middle-class Ealing, there are people who could be living in poverty or on the breadline, or battling with mental health crisis, or suffering from abuse, and living in unstable home environments. And those people could be our friends or family or people even in our church, and they might be too ashamed to share what's going on. And so if you take anything away from this, I think a lot of people will look at me and see somebody who is successful or has got a good career or has a certain personality and make assumptions about my background and about my life. And I think, it's just not helpful to make assumptions. People have all sorts of problems, and I think especially in our culture, we spend a lot of time trying to keep up appearances. That kind of brings me to the end of the main part of my talk, but I really wanted to give people the opportunity to ask questions, because I know that this can be a bit of a minefield and a bit of a sensitive topic, so I'm really happy to answer any questions that people might have about my experiences. Don't be shy. Oh, yeah, hello. I did history and English. That's a really interesting question, actually. I think, so the question was, because I studied history and English, how did it go down in the home choosing to study history and English? So a lot of people, I think, who come from immigrant backgrounds are encouraged down certain career paths to do something that their families think is going to provide stability. So in my case, my family really wanted me to do laws, and from the age of 6 to 16, I said I'm going to do law. And as I did my GCSEs and then I was applying for university, I realized I'd been saying that since I really knew what law was, and some of the reasons that people had given me for why I'd been a really good lawyer when I was 6, like you're really chatty and you're really argumentative, were not good enough reasons for me to actually commit to that for life. So I chose to keep my options open and study history and English with a view that I'd probably wind up converting and doing law after university. And I think my dad was a little bit hesitant about it. My mum was actually fine with it because, unbeknownst to me, she had studied history and English, and so had her mother as well. So it was just this happy coincidence that I was going to be the third generation woman who'd studied history and English. So my mum was really encouraging of that. And I went to Oxford University, which is probably the least likely place to discover fashion, but I was, again, really fortunate that I had really supportive tutors. And in my first year of uni, to get out of that kind of really academic Oxford bubble, I started volunteering with a fashion company just to do something creative and have an outlet, and that's what introduced me to the industry and made me think, I really want to do this. And yeah, I had really supportive tutors to help me to pursue kind of a history of fashion degree. But what also encouraged me into that and helped to convince my parents as well, less than my dad, actually. My dad didn't, because he passed away when I was in my final year, he didn't really get to see what I wound up doing professionally. But from my mum's perspective, I was talking to my leaders at church at university about this, because I didn't really perceive the fashion industry to be a Christian environment, and it was something that I was really worried about. I was really worried about it compromising my faith and my values. And I remember having a conversation with our young adult pastor at that church, saying that I was thinking about going into fashion and I wasn't sure. And he just said, well, how many Christians do you know who work in fashion? And I said, no, I don't know anyone because it's not a very Christian industry. And he said, do you think the fashion industry might need a few Christians in it? And that was exactly what I said to my mum. So that helped to reassure her that it was the path that God was sending me down. Any other questions? Lindsay? Yeah. Yeah, so Lindsay's asked what aspects of my childhood were really important to keeping me on track, and keeping my heart soft as well. So it's a bit of a difficult question. So my mum has always been a very committed Christian. My dad wasn't, and I actually didn't realize this until I was a little bit older, that my dad came to faith a lot later. My parents did an amazing job of showing a united front and making decisions together. Sometimes they made bad decisions together, but at least they made them together. And so it was, it was my dad who was the one who would drive us to church and who would encourage us to participate in church activities. And it was actually when I came back, I was visiting from university, that my dad had listened to a sermon about taking communion and the kind of commitments that you needed to make. And then he stopped taking communion, and I realized that he was actually going through that questioning. And so I think certainly my parents having that commitment to trying to provide stability and having that kind of, I guess, united way of raising us and providing that environment, even if it was a bit unstable, was really helpful. In terms of keeping my heart soft, I mean, there are a few things. One is when we were living in the bed and breakfast, it was a really unusual situation because, on the one hand, my parents were very educated people. They did come from different economic backgrounds. My dad came from a really poor background in Mauritius. He was actually orphaned at the age of 9. My mum, completely the opposite, had actually come from quite an affluent family. We met so many different families living in their bed and breakfast. A number of people were asylum seekers, so that they were fleeing conflict or persecution in their home countries. Some people were economic migrants whose relationships had broken down. And I think that can really humble you as well. You really can't make any assumptions about what situation will lead to people winding up in those circumstances. And it's something that I think it humbled us, but it presented us with a real perspective about how things operate in this country as well. In the Home Office has different priorities when they're processing people through getting permanent leave to remain in the UK. We weren't asylum seekers. We weren't economic migrants. We really weren't the highest priority for the Home Office. So just having to play that waiting game and knowing that we had seen other people in that bed and breakfast situation, they had come out the other end. We'd seen that happen for other people. And I think when you're in that kind of shared experience, you celebrate every success. So like, your win is my win, and we could see it happening for other people, and we knew that our turn was going to come. And the other thing was friendship as well. I have amazing friends from all walks of life, really close Christian friends, but also friends who I've collected from all of those different places that I've lived. And that, I think, helps to... there are some people who really know what we've been through because they witness those different stages. I don't think any of our friends really understand the full story because there were so many different areas where we built community and built those relationships. But friendship is really precious to me, and I put a lot of effort into trying to maintain those friendships, and that helps to keep me connected to those experiences as well. Any other questions? Well, I'm going to be here around after the talk as well, so if there's anything else you want to ask me, do feel free. I just wanted to kind of wrap up by saying that there's absolutely no shame in suffering hardship, and we know this because Jesus, the Son of God, was a prince who humbled himself, and he began his childhood as a refugee, and he lived frugally with no security, and he took on the shame of the cross for the sake of being able to extend that grace to us. And I know that God's grace is sufficient enough to cover our shortfalls. So when we see ourselves as insignificant, or we're feeling ashamed of our personal difficulties and afraid to reveal that truth about ourselves, God sees us, and he says, have faith, and he really does beckon us to share his glory. So if this has touched anyone, if you're considering any of these issues, it doesn't have to be something as deep or as direct as an immigration problem. But if you're suffering any sort of hardship or financial difficulties, something that you'd like prayer for, then we'd really welcome you to do that. I know Karen and Coral are really happy to provide prayer as well, and so am I. And we'd really welcome you to just reach out for prayer and for support as well.